Welcome to The Human Edge. This week's guest is Conor Gearty. Conor is a human rights barrister. He's a professor at the London School of Economics and he's a published author. This was a fantastic and wide-ranging conversation, but what struck me most of all about it is that Conor's incredibly bright, incredibly articulate, but yet, like everybody else, he has his insecurities and vulnerabilities, and that's what this podcast is all about. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. If you do, please like, please share, please subscribe, all of that good stuff. It will be massively helpful. Thank you. So this is Conor. Welcome. I was going to say welcome back, but we didn't quite have the first time around because of your bike accident.
Yeah.
And it got me thinking. This wasn't originally how I was going to begin, but it got me thinking. Last time we spoke, you came across to me as a bit of a workaholic. You're a barrister, Professor LSE, you're an author, there's so much in your life. I think you said to me once you hadn't had a holiday in years. So now you had this enforced break because of the bike accident for a number of weeks or months. How did that affect you?
Well, thinking about the way you framed it, I was asked I did a Q&A, question and answer session in LSE, as you say, where I work, and a student took me aback. I was fine on Palestine and fine on civil liberties and so on, but said, Professor Gearty, how do you relax? Yeah. And I was taken aback because it had never occurred to me that I didn't, but I didn't. So I'm not sure I'm a workaholic, but I don't relax. And I'm resisting workaholic because my personality is bound up with the work that I do, because the work that I do I really find invariably interesting and I choose. So there's no sharp divide between recreation and work because work spills into recreation and vice versa. But therefore, I suppose I needed to rethink that because I had what was probably a bike accident, but because I have no memory of it, I can only discern that it must have been because I smashed my pelvis. So it was quite a serious thing.
Yeah.
And it meant that I took 3 months of work for the first time in a very long time, 40 years plus.
40 years?
Yeah,
wow.
Yeah, because I started teaching as a university lecturer and fellow, they're called, in Cambridge in about 1982, so 83. I started very, very young.
Yeah.
And I've had what in university terms is called leave, but leave is where you write a book or you lecture somewhere else.
Yes.
So I've never had this. And also I wasn't really sick. I was hobbling about on crutches and swallowing quite a lot of what might have been some variant of opiate. But I wasn't sick. So I wasn't off with flu or off with, COVID. God forbid, something serious like long COVID or cancer. And it gave me a long time to reflect on the world I inhabited and indeed the professional and the personal. And what you didn't mention, but I'm happy to mention, is I also have very young children. And so I had to think about where things fitted in my life. So in the course of this period of time, I've realized that I don't think it's a derogatory term, need work. I need some level of engagement with the outside world, and I'm still fit to work. That's a judgment which it's not inevitable that the individual can make themselves when they get to a certain age, which is conventionally retirement age. I believe I'm still fit for work. And that work isn't heavy labor, that work is intellectual labor, so it suits. But what I have to do is control work and take seriously engagements with non-work activities. So they might be arranging Christmas, they might be going on a holiday, and I have arranged holidays for the coming year that are not the sorts of holidays we'd have taken before. Now, the caveat with the holidays is I've holidayed, but they've always been in Ireland, catching up, as it were, with family.
Yes.
So I've redefined holiday as a time when you have a bit of opportunity completely to relax. So I'm doing that. Yeah. So that's a change. And I'm more conscious of the need to prioritize non-work related matters. So I suppose to answer your question fully, the big change has been, and I hope to continue this, has been that domestic, personal doesn't come along as a footnote to a long day of activity, but becomes something which is prominent within the day's activities.
Yeah.
And of course, I'm lucky enough, my job allows that.
Did it also give you cause to reflect on the next however many years professionally, in terms of the kind of the balance of what you're doing, or what you would, ideally what you would like to do for the next few years? But more of an intentionality behind what you're doing.
Well, I commend having this kind of crash, because it's a little bit like being dead, except you're alive to receive it. And the I received were many very warm messages and so on from colleagues and so on, expressing, I think not entirely falsely, they're missing me, etc. But one in particular, a woman who is a very experienced academic, who's a little older than me and has achieved everything you could achieve, really wrote to me. And she said she hesitated to write, but she said she'd seen many people of my age who ignored such warning signs provided by their body and carried on, and then were, as it were, used up when they got to too young an age to be used up.
Yeah.
And a second, that was a very important intervention by somebody I know, not slightly, but not intensely. And then a second intervention was...
And on that, what did you read in that, or what did you hear for yourself in what she wrote to you?
What I heard was, you are going to carry on as you were, believing yourself to be invincible, regarding this crash as having had external causes which are quite unrelated to the way you conduct your life. And before you know it, 5-6 years' time, you will be a diminished figure. Possibly unbeknownst to yourself, you'll be a diminished figure. That's what I heard.
Yeah.
That's what I heard.
Interesting.
And you'll be resembling those of my colleagues, and there aren't many, and are there any, notional colleagues who in their mid-70s are still around protesting their engagement, but are in a way not really appropriately engaged at that stage in their lives. That's what I heard. Okay. That's what I heard.
And you were telling me off air before we began recording about, I think it was about a book that you'd read. Was it by a Polish author?
Yes, Tomaszewska.
Yeah, and in relation to how maybe in the West in particular we don't pay enough attention to what our bodies are telling us.
Yes,
is that right?
That's absolutely right. And a colleague of mine, a younger colleague, sent it to me with a box of chocolates, which was lovely of her, having searched out my address in order to be able to do this. So that was a lovely sort of affirmation from somebody whom I only know slightly. But on that particular point, one thing has struck me very well, very clearly, which is that the body took its own action. So my preferred explanation of my mystery illness is as follows. I had severe gastroenteritis, and it turns out it was a parasitic infection. And it cleared up in time for me to go to Ireland on a day trip to lecture 600 of the government lawyers of Ireland. Ireland's small, and you can fit them all into one room. And the Attorney General invited me, and I was damned if I wasn't going to go. And I went. Yeah. And I was still fine. And then on the Monday, I chaired the President of LSE's inaugural address, had a drink after, won, and got sick again. And on the Friday following, I went to the doctor to say, why am I vomiting? Why am I got diarrhea? What's happening? And I also chose that moment to fit in my COVID and flu jabs, while double teaching for the last week, while looking after 2 children under 10 while their mother was away.
Okay.
And I think my body said, I'm fed up. You don't listen to anything. I've given you a bit of a lead here on the old gastroenteritis. You're ignoring me completely, so I'm going to take my own action. So I feel something about a body speaking to the mind and saying, now I've finally got your attention. And I think that's a plausible way of understanding the world.
That's so interesting. And I agree. I think we go, I was again off air, we go through life, I think human beings, unless we know we're dying, completely disassociated with many of us, with our own bodies, with the concept of our own mortality as well. Yes. And it takes something like this maybe to look afresh.
Yes, I think so. I had a previous in my early 40s, another period of maximum pressure for for many men where they're trying to make their reputation, they're trying to make money, and they've got a young family and so on. And I had a mystery illness of a similar sort. I was flu every year for about 4 years, which I completely ignored. And then my body escalated by having a condition which was never understood, which involves sporadic but consistent fevers. I totally ignored it, and eventually it went away. I paid no attention to it, and I never took a day off work. I actually, amusingly, was in hospital, it being investigated, and left hospital in order to participate in a case. The sole legal question was about what were the signs and symptoms of an undiagnosed condition.
Okay.
My client saying it was
Life
Gulf War
imitating
syndrome.
art or something.
You bet. I had to tell my leading counsel. The client was a Gulf War syndrome, he said, and the government said, no, it's not Gulf War syndrome, you're just sick. And I was sick, undiagnosed. I didn't listen then.
No.
Got away with it. Got away with it.
Okay, but you're listening now.
Am I?
Oh,
It's easy
okay.
to say now at the end of 3 months off work, coming into a Christmas period, which in law, which is my profession, is quiet anyway. But let's see how I can stick to it.
Yeah. Okay. So you were listening at the beginning of the 3 months, but you're listening less now.
Well, let's see. Fit people don't listen.
Yeah.
But even the fact that I articulate that to you gives me a chance.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm certainly harder to get, as it were, in terms of events and commitments and so on.
So I want to spool all the way back now to, well, not all the way back, but how does an Irishman come to be a barrister in England? That's one of the questions that's always, I've always wondered about.
My case is an special case based on my own very particular personal circumstance. So I'm from an immensely legal family. Almost everybody's a lawyer. Including in subsequent, my generation, the women as well as the men. It used to be always the men.
Yes.
Now it's the men and women, particularly my father's family. And my brother and everybody, sister. And it was natural for me to be a lawyer, but I didn't particularly want to do law. But I wanted to tell everybody that I was very brainy. So when I got extremely good results in my secondary school, my parents thought I might want to be a doctor. They didn't mean it in any pushy way. They just thought maybe he'd like to do it. And I could get in, which is an amazing thing, you see. So I didn't want to be a doctor. But I didn't really want to do the arts degree that I really wanted to do.
Which was?
Because a BA in history and politics or something. Okay. Because I was a bit of an intellectual snob. And I wanted to show people I'd got into law, which is absurd.
Yeah.
So I did law. But I did law as a university degree and qualified as a solicitor at the same time, which you could then do, which is punishing. But I took the solicitor's profession because I had developed a loathing of barristers. And the reason I developed a loathing of barristers was we lived in the middle of Ireland. Barristers used to arrive for their cases. They were always from Dublin. They were always men. They were always from what I thought of then as very posh schools. And they patronised the solicitors, of whom my father was one.
Right.
So I developed an aversion to them, which was ridiculous and irrational. But I refused to become a barrister. I became a solicitor. But I mainly wanted to get away from Ireland. So,
and why was that?
Because Ireland in the early 1980s was awful. Poor, benighted place. It was dominated by the Catholic Church. The Pope had just visited and I'm a Catholic, but the Pope had just visited and mobilized fundamentalist Catholic battles on behalf of the Catholic Church against women, on abortion, on divorce. You know, the atmosphere was unpleasant. There was no money in the place. And the politics, there was a fine political leader called Gareth Fitzgerald, but there was a crook called Charlie Haughey. So the political climate was very poor, the cultural climate was poor, and there was no money in the place. But I wanted to go to America, but I wasn't able to afford the universities that would admit me and didn't get into the universities I really wanted to go to. So I ended up in Cambridge University. So I applied to Cambridge and I got into Cambridge University and I went to do a master's. And then I very early on decided I very much wanted to not go back to Ireland. So I got a scholarship to do a PhD, which was a hard thing to get, having done well in my master's course. And I realized this was an escape from Ireland. So I had no interest in research, none whatsoever. I had no ideas, but I knew one thing, which was not an intellectual idea, which was I didn't want to go back to Ireland.
Yeah, but you were an Irishman in England at the time of IRA bombings.
And the hunger strikes were my first 2 years.
So what was that like, being an Irishman in this country?
Well, it's fascinating how the British have distinguished different types of Irish people. And I, quite soon after, it's related to your question, which I'll answer, I became a fellow at Emmanuel College, Cambridge. So I became a very young fellow. And Emmanuel is a very wonderful, well-off college, very traditional. So I was an Irish person in the situation of, for example, in 1984, meeting the Queen, meeting the Chief Justice, because I was in an elite community, let's face it. And so my point is there are different ways of relating to the Irish. And the Irish have this huge advantage in times of diversity over other minority groups, some of whom engage in violence against the country.
Yeah.
That we are white, that we speak English, that we have friends in high places in Britain, and that we have powerful countries that support us. So, as a slight indicator of that, the Metropolitan Police Commissioner was from Dublin, during some of the high points. Yeah.
Okay, I didn't know.
Some of the judges were from Ireland. So I felt that there were two types of Irish people. The Irish who were in Kilburn, to use the famous Irish area of London, were certainly quite often the subject of discriminatory action. Their travelling to and from Ireland was difficult, epitomised by the Birmingham Six, who, were caught on the way to Ireland, but they were just going to a funeral, as compared with me. So the type of discrimination I got was, I remember one colleague in my first college saying to another, "Oh, we know Conor, he's very Irish. He's very Irish." Or the Queen asking the bursar after I'd met her at the college, "The Irish chap," because she obviously met no Irish people.
Yes.
Or rather, as the Duke of Edinburgh said once on a visit to Trinity College, having met an array of Trinity fellows, he said, "When am I going to meet any real Irish people?" Partly why I liked the Duke of Edinburgh.
Yes.
So there was that, which it'd be very hard to get very cross about. Very hard to get very cross about. And therefore, I was, if anything, I was unusual to my advantage. So the students never forgot being taught by me, because
They remember the voice.
they remember the voice.
Yeah. Yeah.
To this day, I was in a court case in August of this year, and the judge interrupts. I'm wearing my little uniform as a barrister, and I'm on my feet. This is this year, and the judge interrupts to say, "Professor Gearty, may I just say it's a tremendous pleasure to have you in my court, but I'm finding it hard to forget your lectures in," and he named the rooms, and he named the year in Cambridge. And I taught him. My solicitor, amusingly, said he knew the case was lost at that point, which it was, because he'd never risked that if he was going to find for me.
Yes.
I never thought of that.
That's true.
So in a way, this man could remember me. If I'd been, in inverted commas, a kind of ordinary English chap from a decent school who had gone into this, would he have done? The accent.
That's so interesting. One of the reasons for asking the question, and one of the kind of the rationale for the podcast in the first place, was to understand how successful people have become successful despite the insecurities that they have, because they're human beings. We all have our own insecurities. It's important for me to demonstrate to the audience, to kind of for my guests to tell the audience themselves how they've come through their own insecurities. So, but I'm curious. You come across really confidently. You're lots of lawyers in the family. You clearly speak very well, etc., etc. What insecurities? I'm pausing. I'm wondering, what insecurities did you have, or maybe do you still have?
It's a challenging question. It's a challenging question. Around the time I became a fellow, I was also invited to become a barrister by the chairman of the bar. So here's a pretty lucky life. I am loved at home by multiple sisters and a mother and an aunt and a grandmother, mainly women. I am at university, and then a very important thing happens to me. I'm answering the question about insecurity by dodging it for now, where I discovered
This
that
is a politician's answer, not a barrister's answer.
politicians would never reveal that they're dodging the question. I discovered I have a talent, and the talent was for debating. And I won everything for 2 years, never lost. Observer Mace twice, Irish Times twice. I was really good. I went to Cambridge, spoke when I felt like it. So I had a fortuitous gift. So then I went to university and did very well in Cambridge, and then got all these options, right? So my life, the president of my college was a lawyer, so through his patronage I got the fellowship, more or less, let's face it. And he was a friend of the chairman of the bar, and so I was suddenly offered a Chambers. I didn't take it. So that's a very effortless rise. At this point, I should say that I was anxious about imposter syndrome, but I wasn't. And I never have been. And in fact, I sometimes joke with colleagues about that. Anxieties have not been prominent in my life. I'll be perfectly straight with you. I have had my ups and downs, which are relational. I'm quite tricky to live with. I'm very driven, particularly in an earlier shape in my life. I was very competitive. I can see how I'm striving. I can see how I'm really wanting to be admired, and I want fame up to a point, not telly fame, but I want fame among my community. And part of what I've been addressing just now with this pelvis break is how to manage a life which doesn't necessarily search for that, because I still kind of search for it. But why do I search for it? Because I'm not, honestly, unless I'm missing something, my need isn't driven by a feeling that I'm a fraud. My need isn't to fill a gap where I perceive that I am a fraud in my life or an imposter in the world I've inhabited.
Or not good enough, as it usually is for lots of people.
Or not good enough. So I'm desperately trying to answer honestly without apparent pomposity and overconfidence, because that sounds both pompous and overconfident. But I have had a phlegmatic approach to life. I don't think too deeply. I am bright in a conventional sense, but I don't overthink things. And I've been pretty lucky in that regard, because I can move through things. So the answer is, you tell me, you're analyzing here. I mean, I'm withering on because I'm trying to reach something that is satisfactory, but haven't yet found it, by way of answer.
Yeah, and the answer may be, well, it's not important to find an answer. That's just your makeup, and that's okay.
Yeah, I mean, I've had people talk to me about myself in therapy. There've been certain life changes which were very difficult for me, so I've looked for kind of ways of understanding myself. I definitely had a difficult relationship with my father. My family, like many Irish families, has complicated backstories related to addiction. But I don't think they've tyrannized me. I think they've partly shaped me, but I don't think they've tyrannized me. I needed to come to England to meet people who weren't Irish, and I've enjoyed that. And I've enjoyed the cosmopolitanism, to use a word much maligned these days, of where we live. I live in North London. So I've enjoyed all that. Yeah. But I've not needed proof of my competence, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, no, I know exactly what you mean. And thank you for being so open and honest.
Well, at the risk of seeming insufferable, to be honest with you.
Not at all. Not at all. One of the things this is demonstrating to me is the importance of conversation. And again, one of the reasons why I created the podcast in the first place. I think you and I probably come from kind of different parts of the political spectrum. I'm Jewish, you're Catholic, you do a lot of work around Gaza.
Yeah.
And so in some senses, we probably have very different views, but nevertheless, it's so important to have conversations like this one. Are you seeing in your day-to-day life the political discourse here in the US has been for a number of years now? It's either black or it's white. There's no nuance. There's nothing in between, and so discourse itself, conversation itself, has been really difficult to have. It seems to me in the public arena. Are you seeing that in your life as well?
Huge impact on the people in the world in which I work. And it's become increasingly difficult to separate the political from the personal.
Yeah.
And I absolutely lament that. So friendships across political boundaries are far harder to maintain. Friendships on a personal level can be knocked back by political views that are judged inseparable from the person. And there's a flight from engagement, which makes it very difficult to develop any kind of continuing relationship on battleground issues with friends. And I think that's a huge thing, I really do. I had on BBC Radio 4, talk about the competitive spirit, right? My partner, my late wife, went to the BBC, and I immediately made radio and TV programs, of course, because I had to also be a telly person. Right. So I must have been insufferable. But the show was called The Common Ground. And I framed it and put it on Radio 4 for one series. We subbed for Melvin Bragg or something, so when they were on holiday, we did it. And the idea behind it was to bring people together from radically opposite points of view. And I'm sure I think there's one like it being done now, because
I would hope
it's
so.
an obvious idea.
It's what the world needs.
Yeah. So right from then, I thought it was a very important thing to be able to bring together the person who loves hunting and the person who wants all hunting banned. We even did an Irish one, the person who wants violence to achieve United Ireland, the person who wants to stay in the United Kingdom. Yeah. It was possible then, and I think it's still possible. Yeah. I think it's still possible. But it's a terrible thing. Say, take one of the contemporary issues, which is trans rights. It's a hot button issue. I have a very clear view on it, absolutely clear as a bell, where I'm very sympathetic to trans people and very supportive and so on. But I also believe in free speech. And I made a mistake of signing a petition which was in favour of particularly important anti-trans. She's perceived to be anti-trans. She's perceived to be anti-trans speaker. I think she is anti-trans. Because I confused the fact that many people would construe my support for free speech as support for the substance. Sure. And I made a mistake because I didn't need to sign it, and maybe they were right. So I'm open-minded about this. Maybe they were right. Maybe in the contemporary climate, maintaining the distinction between free speech and the substance of what is being spoken about becomes impossible. So take Gaza. I've seen some tapes. I'll be elusive because the issue is still running, but of a person who's clearly, I'm extrapolating from what I've seen, of the Jewish faith. He's extremely voluble in his opposition to a Palestinian group that had gathered outside wherever he was going. Very voluble. And I've been invited to sort of join a sort of letter of complaint about him, you see, because he has a certain level of power in a certain environment. And I'm not going to do it. Because though it was impassioned, it was articulate, and he's clearly terribly upset. And so he oughtn't to need to have to shout.
Yes.
But the other lot oughtn't to need to have to try and get him thrown off whatever he's doing. So it's a big change. It's a big change. I find it harder. Let's take up your point about Jewishness in Gaza and Palestine and so on. I have many, many Jewish friends whom I still talk to a lot, but they tend to be very hostile to the Israeli government's actions in Gaza and elsewhere. It's been harder to maintain friendships with Jewish friends who are supportive. So there's a sort of fault line.
Yes.
So even I am finding that a little tricky, you know. Now, one or two still, but one or two friends have stopped seeing us.
Yeah.
Because of that.
And where do you think that comes from? Because once upon a time, not that long ago, even if there were two diametrically opposed, impassioned views, it was possible to have a conversation about it. So what's changed?
Well, I think we need to separate out the general drift and then this special case of Israel and Gaza. So the general drift is driven by the well-known cliche is the bubble, the world you live in. So you're gaining support from your community all the time. And so you've become a member of a mini cult. So you are absolutely incapable of understanding that there could be any other view because you're fantastically supported within your little bubble. Now that's sometimes lovely, but obviously we see all the time in the world of anti-Semitism or of racism that your little bubble can support you in wholly unacceptable positions.
Yes.
And you then find it unfathomable that people don't share your views. So that's that one, and that makes it quite difficult to reach out of it. But Israel and Gaza is a special case, if I may say so, because there is this elision between the state of Israel and Zionism on the one hand and the Jewish faith on the other.
Absolutely.
And the analogy I draw is with my own faith. And the Catholics did some pretty grim things, not the least of which would be, for example, the Inquisition, but they also joyfully participated in quite a lot of extermination. And I would be conflicted. My opinion is that I would be conflicted today, but would not support the Catholic Church if it engaged in levels of destruction that I see within the Middle East.
Yeah.
And the other example I give is I got into a big dispute. I didn't follow it on Twitter about this one, but the British had a real problem with political violence in Northern Ireland. And they knew that there were members of the Provisional IRA living in West Belfast who would leave West Belfast in order to kill the British. They didn't destroy West Belfast.
No.
The Irish Republic had until 1998 a claim to the destruction of the United Kingdom because they claimed as of right to rule Northern Ireland. The British didn't destroy Ireland. Now those 2 points, the first of which was made by the chief prosecutor at the ICC, and both were made by me, produced a really strong verbally violent reaction by leading people who were on the support of Israel. But they're my way of saying you don't have to go that far.
Yes. This one's going to run and run.
Yeah. I think it puts Jewish people who really believe in the state of Israel.
Yeah.
You know, Zionism used to be. There's a fantastic book just published about the growth of Zionism by Ilan Papp. But it used to be quite an eccentric position on the margins of the Jewish faith. But for good or ill, it's become central to the Jewish faith.
Yeah.
And that is a really tricky thing for contemporary Jewish people. I do understand that.
Yeah, it's very difficult. And having kind of bemoaned the fact that it's very, very, very difficult now and impossible to have conversations like this with friends, I'm thinking about some of my own friends on certain subjects with whom I just don't go there.
Yeah, that's
so
interesting. Not just this one, but generally.
I'm well aware of my own hypocrisy. On the matter.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons that we miss Trump and we underestimate Farage and we underestimated the power of the Brexit argument is that the people who make the news and opinion never reach those people. So I play tennis with the guy. I used to before my pelvis smash. And he was pro-Brexit. And so I have my guy, you know, and we used to have a cup of coffee, and he's pro-Brexit, and he sort of would definitely support, he watches GB News all the time. And I was talking to him how awful the mail is. So he brought it in one day, and he went through it. And of course, he was saying, look, there's an awful lot of material in here you never even know about, you know. So it's quite interesting.
Yes.
And so it's quite challenging, but actually I really miss it now that I'm not able to play.
Yeah, that is interesting. And I'm again thinking about my own hypocrisy and the kind of the bubbles or the echo chambers I'm in, and not wanting to kind of step outside and read a diametrically opposed view from it because it makes me feel very uncomfortable.
Yeah, and we used to, in the elite communities that took papers like The Guardian, The Times and so on, that used to be our source of information.
Yeah.
So we would happen upon, in print, a newspaper article that we didn't like, but would read it.
Yes.
That's almost completely gone.
Yeah. Were those articles, were those other views expressed in such a kind of a kind of triggering or emotional way as they are now?
No, I don't think so. No, I don't think so.
That's part of the problem.
Yeah.
The kind of the emotion that comes around.
Yeah, and also I think our society's become more emotional.
Yeah.
So there was the relevant cliche is about Britain, particularly stiff upper lip. So there was a kind of constraint on feeling,
Yes.
which was a shared assumption of public life. And indeed, it was a bad thing in many ways because people would suppress their feelings and then they would emerge in a darker way. I mean, you know, look at clerical abuse, for example, where feelings are suppressed, then they explode. Spousal abuse, you know, there's correlations between keeping the stiff upper lip and then the emotional release elsewhere. So it wasn't a good thing necessarily, but overwrought public arena is not a good thing either.
No.
So it's not only that the articles didn't have quite such an emotional reach, it is that there wasn't as much of a market for emotional reach. Whereas now there's a much bigger market for emotional reach and there's no real taboo against emotions, quite the reverse.
There are no checks and balances in place. Are there?
Yeah.
I'm conscious of time, Conor, because coming back to where we began and more of a prioritisation for you on non-work time.
Yes.
And the date that you have with your wife coming up. So,
Well, I mean, that's a very optimistic way of putting it.
so I want to wrap it up, but before I do, the last question I always ask here is around. So the podcast is called The Human Edge,
Right.
and part of that is to understand where my guests' edge are, what makes you feel uncomfortable, what takes you out of your comfort zone. And I realise I'm harking back to some of the conversation earlier, but I'm curious about that for you. As we sit here today, where's your edge?
Because I'm able to mask so much by speed of thought and articulate camouflage, it then becomes important for me to set that aside. And I think you reached my edge when you asked me about insecurities and anxieties. And I am much less inclined to spend a lot of time thinking about those things, which might be because they're not there, or it might be that they are there, and my articulacy and speed of thought has protected me. My articulacy and speed of thought have protected me from exposing them. So I suspect feelings of love, expressing feelings of love, expressing feelings of vulnerability, anxiety is where my edge is. I'm currently in a situation of uncertainty about why I had this crash. I'm awaiting various test results, and I'm pretty anxious about them, but I don't express that. That's my edge.
Okay.
Person of vulnerability, health and emotional.
Okay. Thank you, Conor. That's I applaud your vulnerability in talking about the potential vulnerability.
Yeah, my vulnerability, which I mask, is my vulnerability.
There you go. Thanks so much for coming in.
Thank you for having me.
I'm so happy that we finally got to sit down and record.
Thank you
together.
very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Stu. Thank you.